Like, I was already super maxed out on my debt to income. I couldn't even buy anything if I wanted to because no bank was going to give me a loan. With seller financing, what happens is there's no Bank of America, there's no Movement Mortgage, there's none of these companies that are involved. It's a transaction between the seller and the buyer. There's a contract and a note that's drawn between the seller and the buyer. And the seller essentially becomes the bank. And there's plenty of reasons why a buyer would want to buy using seller financing. So a buyer would want to buy using seller financing because, number one, there's no banks involved, which means the buyer doesn't really need to have tax returns. They don't need to have a credit score. Their debt to income could be maxed out. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Learn Like a CPA podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Bakey, and today we're going to be talking about seller financing. So it's a pretty hot topic recently with the rise in interest rates, and I want to say about a little bit, probably 14 months ago, I remember talks of seller financing becoming more popular, and I vocally expressed my concerns on Twitter and Instagram, and I said, well, wait a second, pump the brakes. I don't think it's completely here yet. And here we are a year later, and it's being prevalent in almost every single deal. It's an extremely interesting topic. With seller financing, what happens is there's not a bank. There's no Bank of America. There's no Movement Mortgage. There's none of these companies that are involved. It's a transaction between the seller and the buyer. And throughout this series, you might hear me talk about the borrower or the buyer. It's going to be the same person, but you have the seller and then the buyer of the property. And so typically seller financing, you're going to have the person is going to own the property outright, or they're going to have substantial equity in the property. And so this is going to be a property that's owned for a long time. And we're going to get into some of the specifics later. But with that sale of that property, there's a contract and a note that's drawn between the seller and the buyer. And the seller essentially becomes the bank. So if I own a property, let's say the property is worth $100,000 and I own it outright. So if I was to sell it and go to a realtor and pay closing costs and commissions, fees, etc., I might be left with $90,000. And then in some of the previous episodes, we talked about taxes and inflation, right? And that $90,000 is going to, that $90,000, I got to pay taxes on that, and then I might have inflation erode it. So there's plenty of perks to why a seller would want to sell, and we'll get into that later on. And there's plenty of reasons why a buyer would want to buy using seller financing. So a buyer would want to buy using seller financing because...
Real quick, guys, if you could think about how you found this podcast, maybe it was on Facebook, Instagram, maybe somebody shared it with you. I don't run ads for the show or have sponsorships, so the only way this grows is through word of mouth. If this was valuable for you in any way, the only ask that I can make is that you share it with somebody else. Pass it on to the next person whose investing journey or business can be changed by listening to the show. Much love, guys, and let's get into the episode.
A buyer would want to buy using seller financing because, number one, there's no banks involved, which means the buyer doesn't really need to have tax returns. They don't need to have a credit score. Their debt to income could be maxed out, and a buyer can buy a property seller financing. And it's interesting because this is how I actually bought my second rental property, was through seller financing. And I'll kind of share the story of how that worked. Well, when I had bought my first rental property, at the time, I was making about $60,000 a year working at Deloitte, and the property that I had bought was about $250,000 loan. So my income compared to the loan amount, like, I was already super maxed out on my debt to income. So I couldn't even buy anything if I wanted to because no bank was going to give me a loan. And what was interesting was I got a text from the seller a couple weeks after I closed on the property. And Jeff was his name, by the way. He's like, "Hey, Ryan, just, checking in on things. I drove by the house. Like, looks like you're doing some work on it. And I just want to let you know that I'm selling 6 or 7 other houses." And I said, "Well, really?" He never had told me that during the process. And so if you're a seller selling multiple houses, probably not, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing to announce that you're selling all your rental properties and moving states. But either way, I kind of saw that, like, this guy was trying to get these properties off his books. And I told him, I said, "Well, look, I want to buy the property from you, but I can't get a conventional loan from a bank because my debt to income is maxed out. No bank's going to give me a loan. And so we need to kind of get creative here." And at the time, he had never heard of what seller financing was. He had owned dozens of rentals over the course of his life, but he had never heard of what seller financing was, surprisingly enough. And it took a few conversations, coffee, breakfast, to convince him to seller finance it to me. And that And the way I was able to convince him, which is something I'm going to talk about in the later episodes.
Hey, real quick, guys, wanted to interrupt the podcast episode today to make sure that you check out some of the free tools that I have online. So these are going to be tools that are going to help you analyze deals to see if they're good investments. They're going to help you track your rental property investments, and they're going to be tax training tips. So you're going to get access to all my pro formas, all my tax trainings, all my strategy completely for free. So make sure you download it. It's going to be linked in the podcast here below. And now back to the show.
And the way I was able to convince him, which is something I'm going to talk about in the later episodes, give you guys a little sneak peek, is I told him, hey, look, you don't want to sell all 6 or 7 of those houses in the same year because you're just going to get eaten by taxes, because all those gains are going to like stack up at the same time. And then you're going to have this massive tax bill come April. So it is in your best interest to try to defer some of this income, like try to get some of those gains off your books. Like you could still sell the properties and move down to Florida, which was his main concern. He had all these properties in Illinois and he's ready to pack ship and move to Florida. It's like you could sell all these houses and get rid of them. But what are you going to do about taxes? Because you're going to sell all of them and have a huge tax bill. So that was actually how I was able to convince him to seller finance it to me. Even when interest rates were super low at the time, I was able to do seller financing. And that's going to be a sneak peek and a prequel to some of the other later podcasts about, why should you buy using seller financing? We're going to talk about how to convince a seller to do seller financing. We're going to talk about the tax implications of seller financing. And we're going to talk about how do you even find some of these seller finance deals in some of the later podcast episodes. So just giving you guys a little sneak peek of seller financing, because super popular today. I'm going to have tons of little coursework and training materials and templates that you guys can use for seller financing, but I'm super excited to kind of dive into that and explain that to you guys. So check it out in the next episode. And by the way, if you are looking to take action, you're looking at what's the next step here, I have a Facebook group. It's got over 8,000 real estate investors in there posting daily, talking about tax strategy, information in there. And so go check that out. It's going to be on Facebook, Tax Strategies for Real Estate Investors. Feel free to join, shoot me a message like, hey, Ryan, just found you from the podcast and we'll love what you have to say, and shoot me a message in there and I'll respond back, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.